So we have Sue, Amy, and Sam. Would you please come up on stage? Okay, it's been a long day. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to hit the bottle. And the couch. All right, so we're gonna just cut through the chase because it's drinks right after this. And so we'll keep this very interactive, and obviously I've not had a chance to prepare, so I have cheat sheet here. Before we get started, let's keep this interactive. You guys have been amazing, super engaged, super patient, but I want to make sure you don't fall asleep. So please raise your hand as we go, and if you have any questions, we'll try to weave them in. So this is a two-part conversation. The first part of this is how do you get to, we've talked a ton about senior leadership. So the first part is how do you get to these VP, SVP, CTO roles. And the second half of this conversation is going to be about executive compensation, which is a huge, massive black box. So with me today, I have Sue, Amy, and Sam, who are amazing in their own right. I will let them introduce themselves. So for all three of you, I want you to talk about yourself a little bit, but more importantly, it's 3:30. Why should the audience listen to you? Sue?
All right. You've heard me a lot. I'll keep it brief. I'm Sue. I'm the CTO at Trusted Health. And I think, there are so many adversities you face, but the path to really getting to VP and CTO is one, you want to first figure out why you want to get to VP CTO. And then two, figure out, as Nidhi said, like how do you knock on, like don't wait for somebody to knock on your door. How do you go and knock on some doors and really figure out what to watch out for and what to learn? And then lastly, be fearless.
Yep. Amy?
I love that. So I'm Amy Reicheneder. I'm the Chief People Officer at Databricks. I've been there about 4 years, so I've seen growth from 500 to 6,000 people over the last 4 years. And over the course of my career, I've always been super passionate about helping women uncover their superpowers and figure out how to get themselves into roles where they can really have the big impact that they want to. And part of the reason I was really excited to be here today was that I love the whole concept of like taking the veil off compensation for women so that they really understand and have the information that they need to get everything that they deserve. Sam, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Hooley. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. Before this, I spent about 10 years building and leading an executive search firm called Riviera Partners. And so I knocked on a lot of your doors. I started my career as an engineer, went into M&A consulting and advisory, and got to know the people side of the business. And why I'm excited to be here today is because I've had literally thousands of conversations negotiating contracts with executives, and I've seen it go very right and go very wrong as well. So if we can help anybody, at least one person, then we've helped today.
Okay, so Sue, I'm going to start with you. You have a very interesting story about getting to VP. You want to share that? Speaking of being fearless.
Sounds great. When I started my journey in consulting, so I used to work for the small company, and I did a bunch of stuff, front-end development, back-end, and so on. And I, at one point, realized I really wanted to get into management because I really loved understanding why businesses are trying to solve the problems that they're trying to solve for. And two, I wanted to work with people and inspire them and connect the dots between people and business. So when I went and talked to my CEO, and I said, I want to be a manager, he said, you're crazy. Manager path is like just a losing path. You should go pursue an architecture route. I came back, I felt very dejected. I slept on it for 6 months, and then I continued to realize, no, this is exactly what I want to do, and I really am passionate about pursuing a career in management. So eventually, I found a job as a manager, as a first-time manager at another company, and when I went and resigned, he was furious, and he basically called all the employees in the company, and then in front of everybody, he almost said that I betrayed him and everybody else. And then he also said, you'll never make, then he asked me why I wanted to leave. I said, I eventually want to pursue a path to a CTO. And then he said, you'll never make a good CTO in front of the whole company. And then you'll never make a good manager and never make a good CTO. And that's the moment like I decided I will get to the CTO path. And then so I left, and then that was always my goal. And I continued to work across different companies, keep an eye for solving interesting problems, and just embrace everything that came along the way. So
and you recently joined as a CTO. What was how?
Yes, so I joined, since then, I joined different companies and was part of public company, private company and stuff. So I was a VP of engineering at Apartmentless. I've been an executive across 3 companies, but never had that CTO title, and it didn't really matter to me. But what I actually realized is the title does matter in certain cases. Don't let people tell you it doesn't, only because it's all about perception and how people view. And a lot of opportunities that come across your table changes based on how people actually perceive you. So I was a VP at Apartmentless. I was very comfortable, I was happy, and then there was the CEO who reached out, and it was a 6-month long conversation. Probably Sam can relate to this. And I was not sure if I really wanted to, but at the end of it all, it was like he inspired me because he's like, I need you to join me on this path, and this is what we're going to do to make this company great. And then I wanted him because I was like, okay, this is what I really want out of my career. I want to make an impact. And so we kind of joined hands, and that's where I ended up.
So first, I hope that you DM that CEO or whatever his title was at some point. Okay. With your extensive experience as an exec recruiter, Sam, when somebody, first getting that breakthrough first VP role is very difficult. And it's very hard to get past exec recruiters because they'll be, whatever your latest thing on the resume is, it basically becomes your thing. So what do you look for in a resume or a profile, and how do you assess a candidate for are they VP material or not?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it is what you can do, not what you have done. And so being able to tell your narrative about why you think you should be that person, that role, that level, is important. So having your narrative and being able to explain that is important. So what I look for is ownership. So I think they talked about being a business executive. It's not just about technology at the leadership point. It can't be, because you are there to build stuff and sell stuff, and the selling stuff is very important. And so I think being able to understand the drivers of the company, what matters to you. The question I always ask is, what do you love doing? And if it's technology first, you should ask yourself, is this the right path for me? But most of the time, great executives say, I love making careers for people. I love building effective teams. I love mentoring people through hard challenges. Like, that has to come first.
I couldn't agree more. I was interviewing at Hired, and my first meeting was with my CEO. And after the fact, it was a long process, but after the fact, he told me, he's like, you had me at the first sentence. And the first question he asked me was, so Nidhi, tell me about you. And my response was, for me, it starts with people. And he's like, right then and there, I knew that this was the person for us. So couldn't agree more. I'll stay with you. A lot of times, especially for that first role, you end up with, especially if your title is that of a director, you end up with, okay, a little bit title inflation, join a small startup, still a 15-person company, you can come in as a VP. Good move, not a good move?
It's a great move if it's the right role. So one good question to ask them is, what are the 4 things you need in the next 4 years for this function to be successful? And you should be very good at 2 of them, at least. If not, it's going to be very risky. So there's this risk-reward ratio. You should think of it as, what am I going to be able to really lean into, and what's going to be a stretch for me? So what will you learn, and what will you leverage? And if you can do that, if it's the right role, there are lots of companies, especially now, where founders are saying, I'd rather take a bet on someone who's hungry and scrappy and motivated to succeed, rather than someone who maybe has 3 playbooks and is only going to use the 3 of them and not learn and adapt to times that are very different than even a year ago.
Got it. So Amy, I'm going to come to you now, because you've seen the entire spectrum of startup, tween, teen, large company, and also mergers into like acquisitions. So from your perspective, and we have like, a lot of people in big companies. So if I'm at Google, if I'm Avital at Google, how do I become a VP? How do I get that coveted VP title?
I think context is really important. So, Sam sort of alluded to smaller companies may be more willing to take a risk on someone and put them in a VP role for the first time. But I look at this sort of continuum of results versus people and how different organizations value those. And really, of course, every company will say they want both results and that they value people. But in reality, whether it's said explicitly or not, they're on some continuum. And companies who value people more will be more willing to take a risk and put somebody in a role doing something they haven't done before. And companies that are really results focused tend to be very clear on, like, I only want to put somebody in the role when I've seen that they've demonstrated all the skills for it, or they've done it 3 times before. And so I think one of the things that you want to be really thoughtful about is when you're joining an organization, whether it's small or large, but where are they on that continuum? Because that can differ greatly regardless of size. But I think, when I think about small, medium, and large companies, I think about the skill sets that leaders need in order to be successful. And small companies, usually you see people that are sort of high on visionary skills and that they can do this sort of early creative work. Mid-size, you tend to hire builders, and that's the thing that is their superpower. That's what drives them. And people who work in larger organizations have the ability to, run large-scale teams, and they're typically more adept at sort of incremental improvement and driving continuous improvement rather than the early building phases. And so I think it's a combination of like understanding the size of the company and what they need, and then understanding what your superpowers are. And it's very rare to find executives that do all 3. They typically do well, and then they sort of cap out when it gets to a different set of skills.
So if I'm a director at a Meta or a Google today, and I have, let's say, a 300-person team, is becoming VP essentially about span of control?
I think there's so many more skills that go into it than just span of control. I mean, somebody who works as a director at Google may have a large team, and they could be recruited into a mid-sized startup to run an even smaller team. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the skills will transfer across, because the skill sets in a smaller company may be very different, and that you have to work more cross-functionally. Your role will be broader and your influence might be broader, versus in a larger organization, your team might be broader, but your focus will be narrower. And so I think all of these experiences are really valuable. It's, to me, a question of finding out what you're really good at and what drives you and fills your cup, and finding that in the organization that you want to work for and that you're passionate about. It's really about the connection between those two.
So I'm going to pause here and see if people have any questions before we continue. Go ahead.
Hi. When as a leader or an executive in a company, when you are looking at who is your next VP internally, what are the skills that you're looking at, and what is it that will get you notice one person more than the other person?
Yeah. I think it comes back to this sort of results versus people spectrum. And I would say in some companies, if they're more results focused, then they're looking for people, even at the current level, who they see have already demonstrated the capabilities that they need at the next level, whether it's the subject matter expertise, the people leadership capabilities like that. Companies where they're more willing to take a risk on people, then they typically tend to look for people that fill in the white space around them. So they've gone into their role, but then they look around the organization, or noticing, like, here's a problem over here, I'm just going to lean in. And I was never particularly planful about my career, but what I did find was that was my orientation, that I often looked around companies and was like, hey, here's some big hairy problem over here, can I help with that? And then I just take ownership and try to help solve that problem and help people around me. And so that was how I tended to move up in my career, not because I had some big goal to be a chief people officer, but because I loved working with people and making an impact. And so that's what helped me progress. And so I think it depends on the type of company that you're in, but that's typically what I see in different environments that will help depending on what the culture of the company is.
So a follow-up to that, Amy. So in a smaller startup, it's much easier to shine or not, but larger companies kind of tricky. So give me some specifics to Garima in terms of what are some of the things she can do to shine in such a large organization like Workday.
Yeah. I think the main thing that you want to do is focus on impact. And I think the alignment with the leadership above you and around you in terms of what's important to them and how you're delivering value is the main thing. And not to be sort of narrowly focused on what's in front of you. And it's been hard. I mean, over the last few years with COVID and working from home, that getting that larger context gets harder and harder. And depending on what your return to office policy is and all of that, I mean, you're spending most of your time most likely isolated at home on Zoom. And so we're missing all of the cues about and all the informal conversations to help figure out what those white spaces are. So I think over communicating about that and asking those important questions. And when you do have time with people that are around you that are in key roles or with your own line of leadership, like lean in and ask the questions about what's important, how can I add value, what's keeping you up at night, like just lean into it. And you'll find that people, first of all, people love talking about themselves and what's important to them. So just take advantage of that. But I think that, just taking the implicit and making it explicit in this world becomes more and more important.
I will also say too, to Amy's prior point, find out what you're great at and what you love doing. Are you a builder and innovator or a maintainer scaler? And if you're a builder innovator in a large company, find something no one else wants to do that's 0 to 1 and just throw your hand up, right? Because that'll give you an opportunity to put yourself in a situation to be successful at what your superpower is. And there aren't a lot of people who are willing to they view it as a risk, but it's really not if you think about it.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point because oftentimes when you get that call from the exec recruiter, the first thing they'll ask you is, what do you want to do? And if you're like, I just want to run an engineering team, that's not a good enough answer, right? So I think figuring out your superpower and building your elevator pitch around that is very important because at the end of the day, a job is a marriage. So, a lot of times, people within the community, they'll reach out to me and they'll talk about they want to get to VP. But I'm like, you should be interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you because you're going to see them more than you'll probably see your spouse. So you want to make sure that this is the right fit for you or it's not going to work out. Right? So I'm going to go back to you. So from VP to CTO, how has the role fundamentally changed? Is it different?
It varies company to company, but in my case, it hasn't changed as much. I think at Apartmentalist, I was involved in not just running the technology organization, but really running some key business lines and really coming up with our SEO strategy, figuring out how we need to push that forward, acquiring a company, being part of board and really articulating a plan of how we're going to actually move the needle on the business, but also being an external voice to the company. And I just didn't have the title at that company, but I pretty much do a lot of those things here at Trusted as well. So it really depends what type of a CTO you want to become. Like, are you that external facing CTO? Are you responsible for driving both the technology and the business strategy? Or are you like a builder, as Sam said, and you can totally be hands-on and go to an early stage startup and really like build it ground up and build all the systems and put a plan together. So it really depends from company to company. In my case, at least, it hasn't changed as much.
So you're basically saying you define your own role, if you will, especially at a small company, right?
Exactly.
Sam, is that consistent with what you see?
Absolutely. And as the company gets larger, you have even more freedom to define your role because you can hire more people to do things you're not good at. And if you're a good leader, you'll hire in your weaknesses. So.
Amy, do you see a difference in terms of how large companies see a CTO role from an SVP role?
I think it really depends on the organization. I mean, it's very context specific because the CTO role can mean a lot of things in a lot of different companies. And so I think just really understanding what it means in the context of the company that either you're interviewing for and want to work for, or in your own organization so you know what's valued or how you can fill in around that person to add value, I think is the most important. But I don't think it's one size fits all.
Got it. Okay. So we're going to switch gears to comp. I will be the first one to admit I used to suck when it comes to exact comp or any comp or negotiating for myself. Having said that, this conversation is actually not about negotiation. This conversation is about understanding executive compensation, because much like these VP, SVP, CTO roles, which never get published, exec comp is also another thing that just never gets published, right? At least once a month, somebody from the community will ping me saying, hey, I'm negotiating this offer, I'm getting this first VP role, I don't know what to ask for. What are the components of it? So that's the reason why we wanted to have this conversation today. So let's just start there. So Sam, what are some of the components that we should be aware of?
So I think it depends on if you're at a public company or a private company.
So let's start with private.
So private company, there are 3 components. There's cash, so salary, bonus. Some companies, especially early stage ones, may not have a bonus structure. Typically after Series B, Series C, they'll put an MBO or bonus structure in place. So bonus, salary, bonus, and then equity. Equity is super complex. We could talk for hours about equity, but you should understand some of the levers in equity in a private company. In a public company, the equity piece is transparent, it's there for you, and then it just becomes knowing what the market is.
So at least in the startup world, it's fairly opaque. Amy, what about your world? Is there greater transparency when it comes to exec role compensation?
Not really. I mean, I wish it were, but there's been obviously amazing progress in terms of pay transparency laws, but as you said, most executive roles are never published. So you're not going to have the advantage of like seeing the range. And the process that companies go through in order to establish competitive pay for executive roles is very different. They typically have a very narrow peer group that they're benchmarking, again, of similar sized companies, and that's what they use on a per role basis to establish the compensation versus using broader ranges that may apply to a large range of roles. So it is hard to get direct information, and one of the best pieces of advice I can give is like you should develop your own network around this. Like make sure you have someone in your world that understands compensation, whether that's an attorney or a network within your own world that knows comp inside and out. But you should, and please, link to me on LinkedIn. I'm in life sentence, so now that we know each other, you can ping me anytime. But just make sure you have those people in your world, because it is complex, it's changing quickly, and it's important that you have the right resources in your own network that can help you with these important decisions, because they have a big impact on your life and your family's life if you get it right. And and you can always then end up with this feeling that you missed something if you didn't end up in the right place on it.
And executive recruiting firms will have at least 5 or 6 different data sources. So if you establish a relationship with executive recruiters, because they can give you the ones that the VCs publish, the 3 or 4 that are out there that require subscriptions. So they'll usually be, the ones that I know would usually be pretty straightforward with you and tell you, here's what the market really is.
Yeah, and one thing that's probably helpful, just to add on to what Sam was saying, that for people to know, is that a lot of companies, particularly smaller companies, will go into a search for a certain position without knowing what comp they want to pay. And so I would say 90% of the time when the recruiter asks the person in my role, like, okay, well, what do you have budgeted for the position? And my answer will always be, can you go find out what the market will bear? And so we want you to go out and ask what other people in similar roles are making, the candidates, so we know we're competitive. And so it does give you, as the candidate, a lot of leverage to ask for what you think you need and what's competitive, but you have to be educated enough to know where you're in.
Okay, I know I said this is not about negotiation, but I want to double click on what both of you said. Because you've told Sam to go find out what the market will bear. Sam comes to me and the first conversation is, so Nidhi, how much do you want to make? That's the first conversation. And I'm like, dude, I don't know yet. And I feel like I'm losing my leverage by putting my number out there to begin with. And Sue earlier said that, titles are important. This is the reason why they're important, ladies, because you get benchmarked by people like Sam. So Sam, I know.
You're like Yusuf. No, so legally, no one can ask you what you make. They can ask you what your expectations are. And so that's where knowing the market really matters. So understanding what the market really is. So there's pay bands, and there's also what the market is. They are not the same thing. So have your relationships with people who have access to those data sources. But also, before you start looking, look at your house, look at your household. Think about what's comfortable for you, because that's the difference between a private company and a public company too. It's going to be much more cash-based in public companies. And so, have a holistic discussion about what is comfortable for you, and because of that, what should your expectations be if you switch roles before you even start to look.
Okay.
Just add one more thing on negotiation,
Please.
just because I think it's something that people don't have a lot of experience with and often need support on, is that when you are negotiating, back to Sam's point about like understanding what's really important to you, is that you always have leverage. You always have leverage. The company, because I do this every single day and Sam has too, is that we have always left something in our back pocket that we're willing to give you. So it is a crime against humanity not to ask for something, but only ask for one thing. Ask for what really matters to you. You can't go in and ask for something to change on every element, you know, base, bonus, equity, some other thing that you want to negotiate on. Pick the one thing that's really important, go in and ask very specifically for what you want, and feel confident about it. And then stop talking. You don't have to explain why, you just make the ask and you're done.
So how did you negotiate this package for, when you joined as a CTO?
Yeah, I think, as Sam said, there are 3 components to it. The one thing that I really focused on, the reason I'm at startups is because I do care about long-term value. And then when I join a startup, I do want to help them grow and get there. So equity is what matters to me the most. So I made it very clear upfront, as well as during, like, you know, when we got to that phase where it's like, hey, equity matters to me. Like walk me through how you think about the value of the business, how it's going to grow, and let's map out what that looks like. And even like went deep into, okay, what if there is a liquidity event? What if there is an acquisition versus IPO? And then how do you think about this? So I kind of really wanted to understand how the CEO was thinking about it and went deep on that aspect. Even at my previous company, when I actually became an executive, I was a senior director. And at that time, I actually had no idea about executive comp. They gave me a huge raise in terms of the base salary, and I was happy. And I was like, okay, this is all it is. My equity was like nothing. It was like, you know, it was like a senior director equity. It was not at all they never adjusted for equity. And eventually, I didn't ask for it because I didn't know about it. And eventually, the company did have an exit event, and then the value of equity did not really yield much. So you have to focus on really what matters to you, and just don't be enamored by one component of it. Look at it holistically. So one thing to really understand is what is that total compensation, and then really like figure out on an annual basis, does that make sense to you? If you're putting in so many years in a startup versus a public company, like at the end of it, do you feel that it'll deliver the value that you believe you are contributing to?
So Sam, she's opened the gate. Let's talk about equity, especially startups.
Bring it on.
So cap table, what the heck? How
So-
do I value equity? Like, what does that mean?
So a couple of key things to look for in a contract. There are equity acceleration events. They might hear them referred to as triggers. Double trigger really means if a company is acquired and then the job is materially changed, that your equity is accelerated. Typically in product development, that doesn't happen a lot. It's mostly for finance and marketing, but it does happen. You should look for it to be in any contract that you negotiate. Cap tables are really important. Cap table is literally usually an Excel spreadsheet that shows the pro rata investors from angels to most recent rounds. What they own, what kind of stock, common or preferred. There are certain things called liquidity preferences. So if there is a liquidity event, who gets paid out? There are multiples, typically from 1 to 3. So you could do the math on how much that takes off the top if there's a liquidity event. So when you do look at a role, walk through with the CFO what the cap table looks like. If they're unwilling to share it with you, sometimes there are reasons, but they should at least be able to verbally talk through what it looks like. If they can't, that's a huge red flag.
Right. So I think there's so much to talk about here. How do I? So let's start. Where should I start? All right. So Series A, pre-seed or Series A startup. What is the conversation I should be having with the CEO? And what should I be expecting as a VP of engineering? What is the ballpark from an equity standpoint?
So let's say Series A. It's probably somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6%. After Series A, you really should think about it in dollars rather than percentages, because ultimately that's what you're looking for. And then what you want them to present you with is what is the optimistic, pessimistic, and projected outcome over your 4-year vesting event. So it's worth $6 million on the projection. If we miss, it'll be 3. If we crush it, it'll be 12, right? And then that gives you a mental framework to say, how much do I believe in the company? If you don't believe it will 3x or more, you probably shouldn't take the job, to be honest, right? And so that'll then, you can evaluate which one of those scenarios do you align with the most.
So actually, while we're talking about this, so can you talk about 83B?
An 83B election is when you get to a point where a company, it allows you to early exercise and pay taxes on stock that you are granted. So if you vest into a grant over, let's say, the first year, you can start to exercise and pay taxes on that. You're capitalizing on the projected upside when there's an event, but the downside is you have to pay taxes.
So I think equity is the one component that, I think, Amy, you mentioned this before, that companies typically have in their back pocket, right? So that's potentially the one component that you can play with, but it truly depends on what you're comfortable with financially, like from a base comp. At the end of the day, you have to run your house. So you figure out how much over-indexing you want to do on equity versus cash. Amy, for a public company, from an RSU standpoint, do recruiters typically share a range? How much flexibility is there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think to Sam's point, typically in smaller companies, you're getting stock options. And then when you move into larger organizations, you're getting restricted stock units or RSUs. And I think in any element of the compensation, with the exception of probably the bonus, they have in mind generally a range that they're willing to play with. And so I think it comes back to the pick one thing that you want to negotiate on, whether that's cash or equity, and then that's where you make your ask. But they'll always have a range that they're working in. And typically companies are considering 3 factors when they're coming to you with the offer. One is that they do want to understand what your expectations are, as Sam was saying. The second is that they have a budget that they're likely trying to work within. And they're also trying to consider internal equity, so they want to make sure they're paying you fairly relative to other people in the role. And then the third factor is, what the market can bear. So, what market pay is for the role and what other competitive companies are paying for that position. And it's a little bit of art and science when it comes to the final numbers for you, but those are usually the factors behind the scenes that they're considering. And so you having a strong perspective about what's most important to you, that they'll usually, within the range they have in mind, have some flexibility. And so that's why it's important to ask. But it's really important that you know your own needs. Mm-hmm. And typically earlier in career, when people are making their first executive role, they are more focused on cash because they're still in a point in their life where that's important. Later in career or after multiple executives roles, people tend to value equity more. Yeah. And so that's at least the trend I've seen. I don't know how you see it.
Absolutely. There's also a propensity for people to say, I want to see their offer first. What happens then is you set up this dynamic of there's a dart and a dartboard, and neither one knows where each other is. And so that's where negotiations tend to fall apart, is if you don't know what your expectations are, which should be set to the market, so doing your research first, you should be able to give your expectations to the company or to the recruiter so that the dartboard can be drawn. Then you have if you want the job, you have a greater chance of getting it because both sides come prepared. And what's the statement? A good negotiation is when both sides lose. But you need to have that dynamic.
Yeah, at least you have to come to the table with something. Yeah. Because every role that I've had, the executive recruiters have asked, hey, what's your expectation and stuff? And you have to at least understand the market to know that you want to be reasonable and can go over the top. You have to understand the stage of the business as well. And sometimes, you might be at a public company and you're used to a certain level of total compensation that comes to you in cash. And when you're trying to interview at a startup, and if you actually give the same set of numbers, it might shock them and then they might just back out. So you want to be reasonable and understand and try to meet them in the middle.
There's probably 2 things I'd add to that. One is that it is a little bit a sign of immaturity if you aren't willing to put something out there, because it comes across as basically that you're not knowledgeable. And I run a large recruiting organization, and when they come to me and say the person won't give me their numbers, my answer is go back and ask again. We're not going to make them an offer if we don't know anything about what their expectations are. So it does work in your favor to come forward, and I think people come from the psychology that they feel like they're going to put themselves in a bad place by giving their expectations, but it is more helpful than hurtful to go ahead and put it out there.
But not too early though, right? Not in the first conversation.
It doesn't have to be in the first conversation, but by the time you're getting to the point where you're starting to come together when you're thinking that you want to close the process, then you do need to have a perspective. And so making sure, even if you don't have it on the front end, but you've gotten educated along the way, it is important at the end.
So I do want to start taking questions, but before that, one component we haven't talked about is severance clause, right? So at the exec level, a lot of times companies offer severance clauses, but at the same time, it's kind of awkward to have that conversation because I feel like, wait, we haven't even gotten married. It's like a prenup, right? So how should people approach this? Yeah. Common, not common?
It's very common. If you're in a C-level position, you automatically should have one. It's not even a question. VP, it's a little bit more variable. There's not a broad range of the amount of severance that people get. So a standard amount for a C-level executive or high-level VP is 6 months, and it doesn't vary much around that. So you don't have to worry like, oh, is this something I should go in hard on? And the first question to ask is, do you have a standard severance policy for executives? And most companies do, even if they're smaller. They'll have something.
And I will say that executive roles, the average tenure is like less than 2 years. And there is a reason for that, because I think on both sides it might not be a good fit. So that is a very standard practice to have a severance clause.
Yeah, especially in a growing startup. And I think it's to add to what you were saying, Amy, typically both change of control and severance clauses are standard across the executive team. So you want to just ask the question if they have that. In the startup world, are severance clauses common?
Not as common, especially in smaller companies, because for exactly the point that it's you don't know, it's a gamble on both sides, and so probably Series C or D is when they start to become a thing. When the company starts to become a thing, so does the executive comp. So.
Okay, I'm gonna go for questions. I'm sure people have questions.
My question is more of mix of negotiating. So as you said, in big company, navigating path is sometimes can become a little more challenging, but you might have options in smaller startups, and title does matter because you get that experience with that title, but then you might have to kind of challenges with compensation. So when you are in that situation, when you are looking for title to gain some experience, but you are losing on a compensation, how do you negotiate within yourself, putting that all equation in place?
Yeah, I think there are multiple things to the compensation. One thing we didn't touch upon is also there is cash, there's equity, there's standard, but then what other things that you might want, like flexibility. So when I joined Apartmentalist, my previous company, one of the things that that was part of my compensation is a mother's helper. So basically they would give a stipend every month for me to actually go hire a nanny to take care of my baby and things like that. And that was like completely outside the compensation, and that was actually a significant amount. It's like how much you pay for a nanny, and that had nothing to do with my compensation. So sometimes it's like, when you're really debating, like, do I want higher title, do I want comp, like just don't think about those two factors. Think more broadly about, can I get flexibility? Like, okay, if I get that title in a smaller company, what impact do I want to have? What do I want to get out? And then how do I build a support system, and what do I need? And so there are different ways to negotiate and get what you want. Flexibility is another one. And maybe even getting a coach and getting your company to pay for your executive coaching is another one. So there are all these other factors that might not cause a huge red flag for some of these companies to offer.
I think one other thing I'll add to your question is that making the transition from a larger company that probably has higher compensation to a smaller startup, don't be afraid of what you have. I mean, it's kind of incumbent on the company, if they're going to go recruit that level of talent, to be at least able to put something together that makes sense for you. It might not match exactly your compensation, and so if you're coming into a higher level role in a smaller company, just, that's when I would share pretty openly where you are. And then it's incumbent on them to go figure it out. And they will. They'll stretch as much as they can if they know there's a gap. And so you can go into it confident that they're probably going to try to go as far as they can in every element of the compensation to still make it attractive for you, knowing that you're probably going to leave something on the table.
Also, if you're talking to a smaller company that's making the transition to a larger company, you may very well, as an engineering leader, may very well be the first out-of-band hire they make. And so they may say, wow, this person's so much above all the other execs, and that's just step one of N. They'll have to up-level the rest of the exec team. So also, it's a negotiation. Don't blink when they say that, because it's in some ways a poker game, but it's just they don't realize they are going to now have to do that for marketing and revenue and people and all the other examples.
And that's a good place to be. You want to be their first out-of-band offer.
Yeah.
No shame in that for sure.
Okay, we'll take one more, and then we'll...
I have actually two questions.
Go ahead.
My first question is, you mentioned that, do your market research, do your homework, know what the market salaries are, but there isn't a good place to do that, especially for startups. Where do you even research this information? Because they're not, we just started seeing this now. Some companies are publishing it, but not all of them. So that's my first question. The second one is, Amy, you mentioned that, pick one thing and negotiate on that, but why not two? Like if you have a little bit, like, you want to negotiate on the equity as well as the base salary, like why not?
I can answer the second question first, and then maybe somebody else wants to answer the first one. But the reality is that the companies are most likely to flex big on one thing. And so you may ask for two things, like the base and the equity are not meeting your expectations, and you want both to be higher. I would drive hard on one, the one that's most important to you. If the offer is completely not in the right ballpark for you, that's okay too. Then you just say that, and you let them go back and solve the problem, rather than trying to pick the pieces and all of that. But in general, I would drive on one. And one thing I will say back to what Sue said is that the way I would think about it, like negotiate on your big rock, and then if there are little pebbly things that you want to, go in on that. And so if you want an executive coach, that's fine. They'll usually play around the edges with those things, but I would generally, as long as like the package is within a range of what's acceptable to you, but you know that you want more, pick the thing that matters the most. And then I'll let somebody else answer your first question.
Yeah, when it comes to compensation, the numbers, so talk to executive recruiting firms, find a mentor who is an executive. You should have that anyway. They will have access to PAVE and Carta, are the two that are really out there. There are tons of VC firms that publish studies to exec search firms. They sometimes will also send them to candidates as well. So the information's out there, but I think the prior, like networking is it's really the way to get it.
Yeah, and all these executive search firms also send out, I think, annual letters, newsletters, things like that, that'll have more detailed breakdown of comps. That's a good avenue. And then PAVE is a really great tool, but you might individually not have access to it, and there might be companies that have signed up for it. So reach out to people in the network who can at least look up and tell you what that looks like.
Okay, with that, okay, sure.
Okay, I got the opportunity to ask the last question. Thanks, panel. I'm Jane, Senior Director of Engineering, work for SurveyMonkey. Thanks, by the way, this is a fascinating conversation. Thanks, SheTO, and organizing this, and my friend Monica there. My questions, I think you guys touch base a lot on pre-IPO company, public company compensation. Can you share some of your insights for a private equity-owned company that's totally different, or how we compare if in the three of the mix, the compensation structure different for private equity-owned companies?
So I can speak a little bit to it, and maybe Sam can speak more. So I used to work for a public company, and then that public company got bought by a private equity, and then they went completely private. A lot of things changed. People were not getting equity anymore. However, still senior director and above still got equity. So I think beyond a certain level, they'll always make room for retention, because they want to make sure that the executives and senior leaders don't depart, even if it goes PE and private, because ultimately they want to really redo and make the company more efficient and put it back on the public market, which is why PE firms even acquire company in the first place. So there are still few pieces that might not be transparent, but you can always negotiate and ask, and then figure out at what level these things will start to unlock.
She just dropped the mic.
Wow.
All right, on that note, I'm sure you all have more questions. Please find them outside in the lobby over wine, alcohol, coffee, whatever floats your boat. With that, I will hand it back to Nandini.